afternoon. Following on from the previous panel, it was very interesting for me. It always is when you're speaking next. How does it follow on? And they were talking about oil and gas industry, and they were talking about renewables. So I want to ask you, actually now, you to think about how do you frame the issues of climate change? I would hope all in this room recognize it's a big issue that we face. Weather patterns, crop yields, even flooding, it's changing already. But what sort of metaphor, what words do you use to describe the issues around climate change? So we do hear people sometimes speaking about it as a battle, even a battle to the death, even a David and Goliath sort of story. You have the young, innocent, growing renewables, and you have the giant mammoth of the oil and gas industry, the older, clunky oil and gas industry. Well, I would rather actually see it in terms of a race against time itself, a race to reduce the emissions from their current levels to something approaching zero before we reach that number of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees average global warming. That's a big race that we hardly ever stop and think about how serious that is to get to near zero in what is really not a very long time at all. So rather than a solo race where somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, in fact everybody else will lose, I would prefer to put it forward as a relay race. So it is about putting our skills, our technologies together, and by performing well together, then we have a fighting chance, using fighting again, but we have an opportunity to win this race, to get to the finishing line before the finishing line is overwhelmed in unbelievable weather changes, and we lose so many of the things that we love. You know, we love our islands, we love snow-capped mountains all year round, we love to live in these beautiful desert climates. But at some point, if we don't win this race, a lot of our coastal areas will be changing forever. So a relay race, and I asked myself, what have I done in this relay race? What have I done to get towards the finishing line? Well, I've had 30 years in the oil and gas industry. I started as a well site petroleum engineer, so that's 2 in the room, back in Brunei, working offshore on an oil rig. Producing oil and gas, nobody thought there was anything wrong with that. Nobody realized, nobody had really put the basic physics into perspective. So I had, as the only graduate on the rig, I don't know about when you started 10 years later, but I was the only graduate on the rig. So it meant that every calculation, every piece of pipe that roustabout put in the hole, I needed to measure. Every bag of cement that went to cement the metal to the geological formation, I needed to be on the cement hopper counting how much went in. So some really pretty boring jobs in a sense, but on the other hand, you had responsibilities for looking after the so-called mud, the fluid that brings the rock up from the drill bit kilometers below the ground to the surface. And the weight of that fluid keeps the hydrocarbons from coming up at you like the dramatic stories that you see. So at 22, it was great fun, it was a good responsible job, but what I loved the most was the community on the rigs. It was about drilling those wells safely, getting everyone back at the end of the week, drilling them to plan, and that sense of community. So yes, I was the only woman on the rig, and I'm afraid now, if you go to a well site, probably still be the only woman on the rig, but it was that sense of community, and when people were off duty, then we'd go fishing together on the back of the rig, you'd be singing together, you'd get the chef to cook the fish for dinner, and it was really, for me, a wonderful opportunity in my weeks off to get to visit the families as well. So when I came into town, as it's called affectionately, so not offshore anymore, I actually missed the community. So the job was more responsible, it was planning the wells, it was forecasting how the wells would behave over the coming years. This would go into the national budgets. So in principle, it was quite responsible, but I really missed the community. And as I progressed through the years, I did a lot of computer modeling. Computers got better and better, as you know, so one could do better models of the subsurface. And the fluid flow, with my background of physics, we made bigger and bigger computer models and had the privilege to have the best IBM computer, the best always to do the state-of-the-art modeling. And I was doing this in Gabon, in Africa, and again, lots of numbers, lots of number crunching, but it was about the teamwork, working with the people, more perhaps than all those numbers. Much as I love numbers, it was working with the people. And this time, it was a very remote location, 2 flights away from Libreville. So although it wasn't working off and on duty, you were a fairly remote location. So you got to know everybody you worked with. My husband and I used to edit the magazine for everybody, for example. So you get involved with the community, and it was that I really, really enjoyed. So we had our first child there. Our son Samuel was born, and then we had a daughter later in the Netherlands. And these guys have always kept their love of traveling, particularly our son, who we were 4 years in Muscat, I was working, and he has a real affinity for this area and actually went on to study Arabic and Farsi and is now in Arab media world. So I think that recognition of the community and being part of where you are, I hope to pass that on to the kids as well. And they really recognize and appreciate the experiences that they've gained from that traveling. But I digress. Back to oil and gas. As I continued in my career, I kept that interest in the uncertainty that there is subsurface. So the range of uncertainty you try to put into a computer model, but it's never going to get perfect. And our panel talked about new companies, new models, new ways of improving how we model the subsurface. That's very, very important to get that better. But when I went into jobs that were like lending money to start up oil and gas companies and then buying oil and gas companies, very, very important the technical was, but it was also important to look at the management teams and the way they operated or did not operate as a community. So having the possibility to actually look at buying oil companies or buying oil assets, yes, you have lots of numbers, and it's fantastic to have a STEM degree to be able to have an appreciation which never leaves you for the uncertainty of the subsurface that you cannot actually poke your hole down and go and have a look at. You keep that with you, but then using that within the trying to understand people's different perspectives. If you're going to sell an oil or gas asset, you will never have a sale unless you have a different perspective on that asset. Somebody wants it more than you do. Somebody sees it in a different way to how you do. And so I developed some experience at least, I don't know about expertise, experience in swapping oil and gas assets. So it's about finding that gap. Also, you were talking about looking for that value difference, different perspective in order to negotiate a deal between oil companies. I loved doing that. It was cross-border, cross-continent, so you had all the different finance, tax, legal issues that were different. But by being able to pull that team together and work together, we could look for negotiating room within that, that asset or that company. So again, it was that people aspect. And by now, the sort of issue of climate change was really starting to how, again, we didn't use the race term so much then. It was, okay, there's something wrong, and we didn't know quite how we were going to tackle it. And I was given the opportunity to review a project which would collect 90% of the emissions from what is one of the largest sources of CO2 emissions on the planet. It's actually in MENA, it's not in the UAE, but it is in the region. So a massive source, a massive industrial complex that has millions and millions of tons of CO2 every year. And it was my job sitting, in fact, across the road in Convention Tower, literally across the road, where I was asked to review this project in the region where you could collect most of the emissions. And that was an eye-opener for me, that this country could get the value from its assets, you could get the products from oil and gas, you could have the jobs, the social benefits of the oil and gas, and you could clean it up and not be causing this massive problem towards climate change effects. I got really interested in that, and then when a job came up to lead a project back in the UK, I actually left this beautiful region to go back to cold and dark England. I don't know, in a sense, I thought I was mad to be going back to the UK, but I caught this bug, this possibility that you could collect more than 90% of the emissions from burning fossil fuels. Not only could you produce clean power, you can collect the emissions from gas-fired power stations, coal-fired power stations. You could also collect the emissions from industrial plants. And in fact, you have one almost coming to completion up the road here in Abu Dhabi to collect more than 90% of the emissions from an industrial process, and the alternative would be to shut it down. And our panel spoke about the enormous economic benefit of all our industrial, chemical, think refineries, think of all the steel you use, think of the metal in your car. It's not going to shut down. So if we're going to have a possibility to win in this long race, long in terms of big race, but we don't have much time, it is important to look at this possibility to clean up the emissions, to clean up the vast majority of emissions that come from all heavy industries, fossil fuel burning for heat and power, where the sectors are multiple, also for transport as well. There are clean alternatives, and you can clean up 90% plus. But I was struggling. I was like, well, if it's so great, I was leading this project in the UK. The UK Treasurer pulled all the funding from it last November. He could do that last November because nobody had heard of carbon capture and storage. He wasn't going to lose any votes for the Conservative Party. Sorry to be a bit parochial here about the UK, but it was pretty bad that nobody knew of this possibility enough for the Chancellor to worry about the votes that his party was going to lose if he just pulled the plug on 10 years of competitions that the UK had been running to have the first carbon capture and storage projects in Europe. Now, there are 15 projects up and running around the world at large scale. I mentioned the one up the road that's opening soon. But you don't hear much. There's not many of them. 15 is not very many, is it? So we need to collect gigatons. We need to be doing hundreds of these projects. And it occurred to me, what I believe part of the problem is we don't have enough women in this industry. We don't have enough women who have those attributes to look at different perspectives, to look at the bigger picture, to look at the possibility of seeing things in a different way, because we're actually reversing the direction of the normal supply chain. So normally, as our esteemed panel member Miriam was talking about, utilities companies, they receive the oil or the gas, mainly gas here, to burn, to create electricity, to create products. Carbon capture and storage, it's the other way around. So the electricity company, instead of the emissions of the carbon dioxide from burning hydrocarbons going up into the atmosphere, as today, then they are sent to an oil and gas company or somebody who will then bury that rubbish product, CO2, and it will stay under the ground for kilometers under the ground. But it's completely the other direction to those companies are normally working. So I do think that women have very much these attributes to think beyond themselves, beyond just their own needs, beyond even their own company, and to be very open to the possibility for the bigger issue of climate change, that we might actually change the way our companies work, the way our companies approach risk, the way we talk and use, indeed we talked about languages, understanding the other person's language. Because those companies that you haven't been selling your product to before, they won't speak the same language. They didn't before because you had a code around the pricing and the supply chain in that direction. There's very different risks, very different codes, very different languages when you reverse the direction of everything. And I would really encourage women to have this technical understanding, but I really think women's antennae tend to be quite well developed to look also around them and to look how other companies work and be prepared to have long dialogues, potentially conflict resolution, towards having this community, towards seeing something that can work together as companies to reduce the emissions from, as I say, electricity, transport, heavy industry across multiple sectors. So it's this premise that I wanted to bring to you this afternoon. That part of the problem with carbon capture and storage, it is also very expensive. They're big projects to take millions of tons at a time out of the atmosphere. But the premise is we need more people who are prepared to put down their ego and to look at working differently, and be that the innovation of carbon capture and storage or other innovative solutions that are not the old way of the oil and gas industry and renewables working in separate areas of technology development, to be looking at how these can be working together. So I don't have time this afternoon to give many examples, but I bring that example of carbon capture and storage, where you can collect the emissions from heavy industry, pipe it miles away and pipe it miles down below the surface, where it will be safely stored for millions of years. Alternatively, there's even an economic that you can use it first of all to push more oil out of the ground, and then the carbon dioxide remains for millions of years at the end of that project. So there are many ways to do this, as always, and there's always more levels of complexity. But it's about that appreciation of community, that appreciation of future generations, not just my own career and my own generation, however important that is, to look and tackle this issue of climate. Then the race is worth working together in. And I would leave by saying, however you choose to be part of this race, whether it's your own behavior changes in your energy efficiency and how you use your energy, whether it's getting involved in renewables energy, or this possibility to be part of the opportunity to clean up the hydrocarbon industry. So that it really is not a sunset industry. It really is possible to clean up and to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I think I have 3 minutes left, so I did bring with me a little video. It is from the project I work on now, which is where the Industrial Revolution started. It started up in the north of England, and one of those areas is Teesside. That's just the name of a river in the north of England. But these rivers was where the Industrial Revolution started. So they had shipping to be able to bring things in. They had coal-fired, quite close fields nearby. So what if we could clean up these old industrial heartlands? So even though it's UK-centered, I would ask you to look and think of an industrial complex that you know. So whichever country that is, if you know, have seen a refinery, if you have seen a cement factory, if you've seen a power station, any big source of emissions, think of that as a possibility that this could be something that's coming to that region soon, and it will come much sooner with your help. Thank you. We have the sound on. Kind of projects for 30 years. But the tragedy is they've been tapping into natural sources of CO2 to actually create more problem, create more CO2, but then they've used that to push more oil out. The new projects are taking carbon dioxide from existing emissions from other sources. So the very first projects are now up and running from power stations that will contribute to reductions in carbon. And then there's nothing in Europe yet, as I mentioned. Australia is looking at projects. You have a project up the road here, and I think that's just a great thing when that's going to be launched shortly. It will be really exciting that it's one of the first projects will be in this region.